Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. If I may have your attention, I'm Ed Juregin, the director of the Baker Institute, and I want to thank you all for getting up so early and being here. This is rather extraordinary to see people awake and here at this early hour. It is a special occasion to have such a wonderful speaker. Ambassador Elizabeth Jones, Beth Jones as we know her, was sworn in as Assistant Secretary for European and Eurasian Affairs in May of 2001. Beth I've known over the years. She's a very close colleague in the Foreign Service. She is truly one of the best who's risen up the ranks. And one thing that I've always admired in Beth is that she never shunned the hard posts. Never, as you can see from her CV. Most recently, before she took on this very important job in running our State Department Bureau for European and Eurasian Affairs, she served as Senior Advisor to the Caspian Basin Energy Diplomacy, an issue that affected many of us here in Houston in the energy business. She was Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the State's Department's Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs, Ambassador to the Republic of Kazakhstan, which was not an easy job, and I remember visiting Beth there when we came through with Secretary Baker at the time, and it was a wonderful trip. And she was Executive Assistant Secretary of State to Warren Christopher, where she virtually ran the seventh floor of the department where all the principals are. She has had many jobs. I can't go through all of them, but she was Deputy Director for Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq. That was her expertise in the Middle East, and she's one of our best experts on the Middle East. And Public Affairs Officer in the Near East and South Asia Bureau in the early 70s. So she's been to the Middle East. She served in the Middle East, South Asia, and Germany. She was Deputy Chief of Mission in Bonn, Germany, and Islamabad, Pakistan, another very tough post. And she headed the Economic Commercial Section in the U.S. Mission in West Berlin in the 80s. And there again, Deputy Principal Officer in the U.S. Interest Section in Baghdad, Iraq, 1979-80. So she's really been in the trenches. Other posts have been Jordan, Cairo. She studied Arabic in Beirut, Tunis, and Cairo. And her first Foreign Service post was Kabul. So Beth, unlike me, didn't go to Bordeaux, France. She went to the really tough places. She's a graduate of Swarthmore College, BA in History, and earned her master's degree in International Relations from Boston University's Overseas Program in Berlin. She speaks Russian, German, Arabic, and she is a career minister in the Foreign Service, which is really at the very top. Please join me giving a warm welcome to Beth Jones.
Thank you very much, Ed. I'm very happy to be here again. Been here a couple times before in various of my other capacities. This morning what I wanted to do is talk about NATO. But I don't want to talk about NATO as just, the old NATO that most people tend to think about, but why is NATO relevant today? Why do we still have NATO? What are we still talking about? And one of the reasons I want to talk about NATO today is we have a very important NATO summit coming up in Prague in November. Those NATO summits happen only every few years, or not every year by any means. So we've done a lot of thinking and working as to why do we have NATO, why is it relevant, and some of the other questions. Why is NATO relevant is one of the important questions. The other question that's very important that we talk and read about a lot is what about capabilities of the NATO members? There's a tremendous amount that's been made of that the United States has by far the best capabilities in NATO, that our military prowess is equivalent or more than that of all of the other NATO members put together. How are we going to fix that? Is that a good thing? No. What are we going to do about it? And then there is, on top of all of that, or sort of intermingled with all of that, is the question of what is going on between the United States and Europe. If we have this NATO alliance, which I will argue we should keep and transform, does that help us? And what Does that help us understand, or does it help us fix the difficulties that we read about all the time between the United States and Europe? Let me start there. There was a very interesting poll done very recently by the German Marshall Fund and the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations on just that, talking with Americans and with Europeans about multilateralism versus unilateralism, about global threats versus sort of domestic issues. And the poll found something that was very interesting and something that was surprising to many, many people, but nevertheless the results of which are very heartening to those of us who work on these issues. What they found is that Europeans and Americans list the same threats as at the top of the list. Europeans and Americans both list global terrorism as the top threat. They list Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, and they list fundamentalism as the top threats. The other thing that the poll discovered is that Americans, with a very, very great majority, support international, not unilateral approaches to the world and to America's place in the world, America's engagement in the world. 78% of Europeans, 71% of Americans believe that international solutions are the best way to go about solving international problems. So we've discovered through this poll something that we kind of hoped was the case, and it turns out that we were right, is that there is a solid shared foundation on both sides of the Atlantic for how to solve our problems, for the transatlantic organization that we call NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But even more importantly, one of the things this poll discovered is that NATO is a very strong magnet for the East. The countries of Eastern Europe and beyond Eastern Europe and the Caucasus and Central Asia are very, very attracted to NATO as an organization and to what NATO stands for. And one of the arguments that we make is that NATO, even though it looks to a lot of us as a military organization, in fact, when you look at the way we discuss issues in NATO circles, we are actually a community of like-minded nations. We believe a lot of the same things, if not all of the same things, about ourselves, about our countries, about our places in the world, and about how to behave in the world. So in thinking about the Prague summit coming up, we set for ourselves 3 goals, basically. Some time ago, one of the goals that was established was the enlargement of NATO. We've had one enlargement of NATO in 1997. We added 3 new members, 3 new countries, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary. There were many, many other countries that were very interested in joining, very disappointed not to be invited to join NATO at that time. But we said, no, the door is open. Let's keep working on this. But we learned a very important lesson then. We learned that we needed to really keep working very aggressively and intensively with these countries in order to build up their capabilities on the military side, but also to get at the shared values, the shared principles that make up NATO. So we began working very hard on economic reform, democratic reform, human rights kind of issues, social kinds of issues. So that is one of the main goals of Prague is for the alliance to decide which of the 10 NATO aspirants will be invited to join NATO this time around, and what the plan is to keep the others from falling off the edge of the cliff, as we put it, so that the door to NATO remains open and these kinds of reforms keep going. The second one is to build and enhance new relationships with NATO, and there the focus has been particularly on Russia, to some degree on Ukraine, and certainly on the Caucasus and Central Asia. In other words, the members of Partnership for Peace, the NATO association that was created after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And the third headline, the third goal for the Prague Summit in November is to address the capabilities gap. And I'm going to talk in a little bit greater detail about each of those this morning. On new members, the President in his national security strategy, which has gotten a lot of attention, obviously, but one of the things he says is, in pursuit of our goals, our first imperative is to clarify what we stand for. The United States must defend liberty and justice because these principles are right and true for all people everywhere. So this is part of what I just talked about, to not only work with these countries in terms of their military capabilities, but to work on the freedom, justice, democracy kinds of issues. And here's what we did, or here are the accomplishments, shall we say, of several of the NATO aspirants. And I wanted to list this just because I don't think it's gotten nearly as much attention as it should have gotten in the media. Some of the success stories in Slovakia, for instance, the government in Slovakia initiated some very, very tough economic and political reforms that were absolutely essential for Slovakia to be considered a viable candidate to join NATO, but also to be considered a viable candidate to join the European Union. Because after all, most of the NATO aspirants are also candidates to join the European Union in December. There was a vote in Slovakia in September. That was a deciding vote. There was basically it was a competition between the reformers and the backsliders. That's probably the nicest term to use for them. And the reformers won hands down. So right there, that was vindication of all of the very hard work that the Slovaks had done, but also all the very hard work that the NATO members had done to work with a country like Slovakia to put them firmly on the road to reform. One of the criteria for NATO membership is that the country has to want to join. You can't just join because the government feels like it or because the Minister of Defense feels like it. It has to be popular in the country. In Albania, the popularity of joining NATO is 90%. It's the highest among all of the aspirants, and it also is an indication of the Albanian popular support, again, for the reform movement underway there in terms of democratic reform, but especially economic reform, very important in Albania. In the Baltic states, one of the requirements for NATO is fair and appropriate treatment of minorities. We are working in all of these countries, especially in the Balkans, but in other countries for inter-ethnic, multi-ethnic societies. And in the Baltic states, the Russian minorities are very important. There are huge Russian minorities in several of them. And one of the requirements was that the minorities be treated well, that minority languages be legitimate, that minority languages be taught in the schools. And all of the three Baltic states passed laws that were appropriate to these goals. And the most interesting aspect of that is the Russian minorities in all of these countries, who were very resistant, of course, to the Baltic states joining NATO because of their association with Russia, their association with Moscow, the antipathy of the Russian government to NATO enlargement. But because NATO required fair treatment of them, they are now very strong supporters of these countries joining NATO. One of the other things that we, especially the United States, worked on in the NATO aspirants was to ask them to do a much better job on Holocaust education, to recognize the tragedies that occurred in their countries during the Holocaust, to set up days of remembrance, and to treat their Jewish minorities as well as they would treat any other religion. That has worked very well in the three Baltic states. That's where the Holocaust issues have been very important. And one of the wonderful things to visit if you're ever in Vilnius is the restoration of the Jewish quarter in Vilnius. In Slovenia, there's a record foreign investment. If anybody's interested in Slovenia, take a look at it. But Freedom House, which has very tough criteria, has listed Slovenia as second. It's the second ranked of all of the countries that they have rated as countries in transition, which is no small achievement by Slovenia. Romania and Bulgaria, there the biggest issues are corruption, economic reform, and all of the work that goes along with trying to tamp down corruption. They've made huge strides and are very, very strongly on the road to NATO membership. In terms of the actual decision, each member of NATO will make a decision about which of the 10 aspirants each country supports. Those decisions will be brought into the NATO Council, and the decision will be made there and announced not until the leaders get together on November 21st at NATO. On new relationships, the biggest concern there was how to enlarge NATO without having a big uproar with Russia. That's the technical term. We were very fortunate in having President Putin basically figure out that that the kinds of things that the NATO alliance was saying was actually quite accurate, that NATO does not consider Russia the enemy any longer, and therefore Russia should not consider NATO the enemy any longer. And we've really worked at that, particularly after 9/11, when NATO began redefining the threat to the NATO membership as terrorism, as weapons of mass destruction, as these great transnational global threats. We brought Russia along in that redefinition of the international threat. And the result of that has been the establishment of the new NATO-Russia Council. There was a big summit to celebrate this in Rome in May. But the big task for us who work in this area is to put some meat on the bones of the NATO-Russia Council, to demonstrate to NATO members and to Russia that there really is something there. There is a reason for NATO and Russia to work together. And one of the big areas that we've found that's the most profitable to work on is on civil emergency preparedness, so that the military of NATO and the military organizations in Russia are working on how those organizations can best practice how to handle, say, chemical contamination, or the blowing up of pipelines, or a terrible flood, or avalanches, or whatever it may be, smaller scale, grander scale. The other countries that we've been particularly working on, as I mentioned briefly earlier, are the countries of the Caucasus and Central Asia, the members of Partnership for Peace. And one of the areas that we're particularly focused on is how to work with all of those countries, those 8 countries, plus a few others in Partnership for Peace, to make sure that the development of international threats that occurred in Afghanistan does not just slide up north across the border into Central Asia and then move into the Caucasus, Russia, and Europe, the rest of Europe. So we've spent quite a bit of time in Partnership for Peace working not only on the military-to-military relationships, which is mostly training in English and training in leadership and that kind of thing, but it's very much focused on democracy, democratic reform, economic reform, human rights kinds of issues, which is a very, very tough slog in these countries. But nevertheless, there are many of us who believe that the engagement that requires with civil society, with economic reformers, is absolutely critical to, first of all, these countries' development as responsible members of the international community. But it is also critical to our safety, because we do not want these countries to be susceptible, or the peoples of these countries to be susceptible to recruitment by extremist organizations because there aren't jobs, or susceptible to recruitment by terrorist organizations because they have no voice in their government. So there's a tremendous amount of effort underway there, which it's hard to see the progress unless you're as close to it as some of us are. And there is, I can point to specific little steps that have occurred in these countries. Something else that's very important about Partnership for Peace is it's not just a group of countries such as the Central Asians and the Caucasus. Ireland is a member of Partnership for Peace, Finland is, Sweden is, countries like that. So we're looking to them and really trying to energize them to take a leadership role in this organization in greater association with NATO as we move beyond Prague into the tasks that we see ahead of us. New capabilities. New capabilities, of course, is the one that one hears about the most, particularly now because of Afghanistan, because of Iraq, because of the great obvious discrepancy between American military capabilities and European military capabilities. And what we've done is we've said, let's look at, let's all of us in NATO look at what the threat is. As I say, it's now defined as terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, that kind of thing. It's not Soviet troops coming through the Fulda Gap into Germany. So we don't need big tank battalions sitting in the middle of Europe. But we do need very flexible forces. We need special operations forces. We need the capacity to move those forces much further away than we ever thought before. We need good communications interoperability, and we need the kind of sophisticated weapons that we have been using in the latest military campaigns. So there is a very big focus on working on only a few capabilities. Earlier, after the Washington summit, there were 58 capabilities named as the ones that all of the NATO countries should work on. We're narrowing that down now to 5 or 6 and saying to our NATO allies, Let's work on just those. We now see that those are the ones that are the most important. And rather than say everybody has to have, without fail, 2% of your budget for military spending. I mean, that's still what we'd like to have. But instead of saying 2% of the budget, we're focused on what to buy, what to do with that money, rather than just you got to have that much money dedicated to it. So will be a focus at Prague on how to focus down on these new capabilities, and there is a proposal on the table that we've made for NATO to train together in a more aggressive way, in a more focused way, for a rapid response force, so that if another, God forbid, another 9/11 happens anywhere in the world, NATO, if it feels that it itself is threatened by this, and that is how NATO is defining the terrorism threat, that NATO forces could be used well beyond the confines of the territory of Europe. One of the things that's very interesting in looking at the capabilities question, too, is what the contributions are and can be in what we call niche areas. So, for instance, even though nobody would want to argue that every single one of the aspirant states is going to have a fabulously big military that's going to contribute major forces or major communication systems or whatever it may be to the alliance, there are niche capabilities among the aspirants that are very interesting to learn about and are now being used in the various campaigns that NATO members are participating in. Let me give you just a couple of examples so you can see what I'm talking about. The Czech Republic has a special military unit with expertise in nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons detection and decontamination. That unit is now deployed with our troops in Kuwait in support of Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. The Bulgarians have a similar decontamination unit, a similar chemical detection unit, and that's deployed with the International Security Assistance Force in Kabul. The Slovenes have been doing most of the demining in the Balkans. They've removed 30,000 mines so far. The Romanians have a mechanized infantry battalion called the Red Scorpions, which is part of the international forces that are combating al-Qaeda in Afghanistan with our forces and with many of the other NATO members. And the Lithuanians have special operations forces in Afghanistan and have sent doctors to the Czech medical unit in Kabul. So even though these units are small, they are very important capabilities, and there is absolutely no reason that every single country in NATO, for example, has to have a special chemical decontamination unit, but we can use the Czech unit and the Bulgarian unit if they become members of NATO, or even now that not even members of NATO, they're still contributing to international security with those units. Let me leave my formal presentation there. We have, going into Prague then, the main areas that we're working on, the new members, new relationships, and new capabilities. As you can see, all of this basically starts with Prague. Doesn't end with Prague. So as we work on all of these issues, particularly I would say what I call the strategic reach of NATO across the continent of Eurasia, to the Caucasus, Russia, and Central Asia, that we have a tremendous set of tasks set out for ourselves, and I look forward very much to talking with you more about how we might accomplish that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Beth. Now the floor is open to questions, and if you just identify yourself and ask your questions, please. Nancy, if you could wait for the that's right.
I'm Nancy Dunlap, and I'm with the Baker Institute Roundtable. And my question is, does NATO have lessons to teach the UN, which is a multi-country organization trying to deal with international issues? What is it that NATO has as its establishing arrangement that's allowing them to work together more collaboratively than the UN?
That's a very good question. Basically, the reason NATO member states work together so well is because they have worked together so well. The NATO forces exercise together, they operate together, they have learned through the years how to work together. They have, of course, all the planning is done by all the NATO members together in the military planning cell in Belgium. So they have structures, they have capacities that they're very used to, and that's common to all of them. When the UN works together, as UN member states contribute forces to this operation or that operation, they haven't ever necessarily worked together. They may have, but that's one of the great benefits, not only of NATO membership, but of the aspirant states, because they have the opportunity to work with NATO in any case and build up their capabilities and the interoperability.
You get the. Thank you.
My name is Joan Allen. I'm an undergraduate student. You mentioned that NATO is working to build democratic political culture through contacts with the Caucasus region and with Central Asia. Does NATO currently have any plans, and if so, what are they, to reach out to the Russian republics, Moldova, the Ukraine, and Belarus, and to try to establish democratic political cultures there?
Absolutely. I mean, NATO member states, it's more NATO member states that are working in all of these countries, but they're doing it to a great degree either in the name of NATO or under specific partnership for peace programs. Belarus is a tougher case. There, the U.S. and the European Union and the OSCE are in the lead in terms of those kinds of that kind of work. That's basically focused on trying to maintain relationship with civil society, with non-governmental organizations, free media, opposition candidates, and that kind of thing to help them survive at this point, basically. But in Moldova, there's a tremendous amount of work underway, basically associated with the Organization's Security and Cooperation in Europe, having to do with removal of the old Soviet-era ammunition from Moldova. There's a lot of economic reform work going on there because of the EU and because of the U.S. and other NATO members. Ukraine is a particularly important case for us. There is a tremendous amount of work underway by NATO members, European Union, OSCE, U.S. bilaterally. Again, very focused on civil society, very focused on economic reform, to close down, again, opportunities for corruption, but also to work on land reform issues, agricultural reform. And a lot of those programs have been remarkably successful, or I shouldn't say remarkably, notably successful in Ukraine. We have a particular serious difficulty with the president of Ukraine related to our complete conviction that he authorized the transfer of these Kolchuga radar to Iraq, the sale of the Kolchuga radar to Iraq, and we're just now, literally today and tomorrow, working on the decisions that we are making and proposals we'd like to make to our NATO allies on how we might treat Ukraine, treat President Kuchma at the Prague summit, because there is a special NATO Ukraine Council as well that we need to focus on. But the idea there is retain all the relationships possible with Ukraine, punish President Kuchma. Russia is a terribly important area for us in terms of the military-to-military cooperation, but also in terms of all of the work that goes on with civil society. There's a lot of huge exchange programs there, a tremendous amount of work being done bilaterally by the United States and in counter-proliferation areas, and working with the Russians to close down nuclear testing facilities and all that kind of thing. It's a very aggressive, very comprehensive program with Russia, and we're basically we keep working with as many institutions as we possibly can in Russia to keep pulling them into sort of Western institutions and demonstrating to them that participation and engagement is by far better for Russia, better for Russians.
Okay, Bob, and then here we get two. We got something to do. Okay, great. Okay. French Consul General.
I'm Denis Simoneau. I'm the Consul General of France here in Houston. I was very interested by your presentation, but I've got two questions, if I may, Mr. Ambassador. The first one is on the fact that you didn't mention at all during your speech the efforts which have been made by the European Union since the summit of Helsinki to develop a capacity of intervention of 60,000 soldiers. So I wanted to ask you whether You didn't mention it because you think it's irrelevant or not necessary and not a support to NATO. My second question is on the fact that NATO was created in a very specific condition. I mean, it was for mainly conventional wars. And my question is, how do you think that NATO could evolve to deal with the new types of war that we have and the war against terrorism, for instance? Thank you.
One of the struggles I have whenever I make a presentation is what to leave in and what to leave out. So I could talk for hours about all of the work that we do, and one of the areas that we spend quite a bit of time on is working with the European Union, European Commission, and NATO colleagues on exactly that, on the development of the European Security and Defense Force because of its importance to NATO, I argue. I would argue that it is, and all of us would, that it is very much a parallel, an appropriate and desired parallel organization, that there is a need for this military force in Europe. Our NATO colleagues in NATO member states have been working extremely well in the Balkans, and we look forward very much to the details between Greece and Turkey being resolved very quickly, so that the European Security and Defense Force can form itself and can take on some of the roles that NATO has undertaken in the Balkans. We're looking very much forward to that. In terms of NATO and its transformation, you're right, NATO was formed for a very different reason than is necessary now. So after the breakup of the Soviet Union, I mean, you know, there was a tremendous amount of discussion. Is NATO still relevant? Do we need NATO? And one of the first things that happened is we found that there are an awful lot of countries that still wanted to join NATO, that it was by no means a dying organization, quite the contrary. And because we do think of ourselves as an alliance of like-minded countries, not just a military organization, we've been working hard within NATO to transform the concept, to transform the definition of the threat. And as I said, no longer need those big tank battalions, but the NATO alliance has determined that it does wish to protect itself from the current threats, and that's what the focus now is on, changing these capabilities. I may say that that the decision of the French government, the very recent decision of the French government, to increase its defense budget dramatically, 15% per year for the next 10 years, is an extremely welcome decision. The French defense minister was in Washington last week, and she had a very, very warm welcome there and very detailed discussions with the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, National Security advisors, and others in Washington about how important that is and how France and the United States can work more cooperatively on the capabilities issue.
We had one, and then over here. Okay.
Bob Patton in the English department here at Rice, and you've already anticipated one of my questions, which was the way in which NATO was mapping on the new European Union, especially since some of the disagreements about policy in the West have come from our most long-standing members of both European Union and NATO. But since that's in a way been covered, let me ask the other question that I think is probably on many people's mind. What is the relationship, and what can NATO do about threats that come not so much from military might as from ideological might, religious and other kinds of might?
This is basically one of the big questions that's discussed in NATO. It's discussed in the European Union, I'm sure. It's discussed in probably every capital of the world. How do we get at the threat? How do we get at the source of the threat? And that's why there is so much more emphasis in, say, Central Asia and the Caucasus on not just the military-to-military relationship, but going after getting after economic reform, democratic reform, and human rights. Let me give you a reason why, or how we present this to, say, President Karimov, especially in Uzbekistan. He says, "So glad to have American troops based at Karshihanabad. That gives us greater security. Never mind that the troops have nothing to do with Uzbekistan. They're never going to be deployed in Uzbekistan to do anything. They're simply there to be transported into Afghanistan." But we say that's right. Security is an issue in Uzbekistan. The United States is interested in the security of the people of Uzbekistan. But you, President Karimov, can't possibly have security unless you address what we consider all of the security issues. You can't have security in Uzbekistan if there are so many people without jobs, because those people are going to be targets for recruitment by fundamentalist organizations, or extremist organizations, put it that way. So that led us into a very aggressive program on job creation, which leads to investment. Investment, if you're thinking in terms of how to attract investment, you've got to have economic reform, you've got to have convertibility of the currency. So we were able to get back into the whole economic reform mode in Uzbekistan that had failed so badly in the first, say, 8 years after the break of the Soviet Union. We also said to President Karimov, and we say this to the others in Central Asia as well, you can't have security if your people don't trust you, won't support you, and the reason they don't trust you and won't support you is because they have no participation in what goes on in this country. They have no say in anything. And it is very dangerous for young men to go to a mosque, because your police forces and troops go into a mosque and round up young men just because they're praying in a mosque, especially if they have a beard. So what you're doing by the repressive measures that you're undertaking with young men in mosques, or by forbidding any kind of participatory voice in decisions in Uzbekistan, is you're creating a whole group of a whole stratum of people who are juicy targets for extremist organizations, for recruitment to extremist organizations. So the policy that we've embarked on and been pushed very hard with Karimov is to have the kind of security relationship that you, as you define it, means you have to have the whole security relationship as the United States defines it, which means this is what's going to happen on economic reform. We pulled the IMF and World Bank into that as well. And this is the funding that we're going to give to free media, to civil society organizations, human rights organizations. We pushed very hard for registration of human rights organizations, pushed extremely hard for the ICRC to have access to jails, to reduce and eliminate torture in prisons, and all that kind of thing. And that's where we're actually seeing incremental improvements.
Steve Graybill, formerly with Barron's Group and now with Bank of America.
Good to see you again.
Good to see you again, thank you. As NATO reaches into Central Asia, do you anticipate any kind of adverse reaction from China?
Here's the way we've been working with China throughout all of the work that we've been doing in Central Asia. China is absolutely suspicious. They are nervous about what this means. So is Russia. But the way we are going after our enhanced role in Central Asia and the Caucasus is to be as transparent as we possibly can. So, for instance, even in my time in Kazakhstan, when we did joint military operations through Partnership for Peace with NATO, for every single briefing that we had, and we'd bring big NATO briefing teams in, we'd do a presentation to the diplomatic community and always include the Chinese ambassador and military attaché and Russian ambassador and military attaché to do as much as we possibly could to demonstrate that the kind of work that we were doing with NATO was peacekeeping training, how to treat prisoners of war, how to look at a defense, how to present a defense budget, the kinds of things that actually, in our minds, are actually democracy programs, much more than they're military programs, although they're done with the military to build up the concept that the military is meant to be there to support the civilian population of these countries. But it is a hard slog. One of my colleagues who's responsible for Caucasus Central Asia also happens to be a China hand. And he is the one who goes fairly regularly to Beijing to, again, lay it all out on the table to say, here's what we're doing with this program, here's what we're doing with that program, ask any question you want. Because there was literally no reason that we should hide a single thing from the Chinese that we do in Central Asia, the Caucasus. Do the same thing with the Russians, by the way.
Yeah, Jim Crown over McKinsey and Company. Given NATO's recognition of terrorism as the central contemporary threat, what is the nature of conversation within NATO about the Middle East in general, Iraq in particular? Or does somebody like France simply say, look, our UN guys are worrying about that, so our NATO guys are not going to worry about that? Is there a discussion, or is it just sort of somebody else's deal?
I honestly don't know if there's discussion around the lunch table. I have to assume that there is. I mean, I'm sure there is. But Iraq has not been taken up as an issue in a formal sense within NATO at all, and the Middle East not in a formal sense in NATO. But especially the Middle East is very much a subject within EU circles, and of course it's almost all the same countries, so it's discussed in that forum. Now with the Middle East, we've developed a new mechanism to pull together the European Union, the US, the UN, and Russia in what we, for lack of a better term, call the quartet. And that has organized the proposals, the initiatives that have been put on the table by all of these different groups and organizations in a way that's much more organized, and that all of the members of this new quartet are quite satisfied with. And what that means, much more importantly, is that when the international community goes to Jerusalem to talk with Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, talk with the Israelis and the Palestinians, it's not the French with this proposal, the Germans with that proposal, the Danes with that proposal, the Russians with that one, and the Americans with that one, which is, confusing in the first instance and completely dissipates the authority of the international community. But the quartet can go in now and say, this is what all of us, the UN, everybody, thinks is the right way for you guys to proceed. And we think it's a much, and so does the European Union think it's a much more effective way to operate.
Okay, well, I have a student here, and then.
Thank you. Madam Ambassador, Ali Arslan, Consul General of Turkey here in Houston. Madam, I have two questions to pose. I'll revert to your statement regarding my French colleague's question. Now, even if we consider the addition of the 15% French plan of increment in their military expenditures, as you know, the EU's combined incremental programs for increase in their military spending cannot even compare with the United States' 2 years military defense expenditures. So I think over the last 10 years we have had more and more diverging power projection capability between the United States and Europe. And when you take this against the PFP programs, for example, training, leadership, and other affairs, and translate it into monetary terms, could you give us an idea about how much the whole of these non-military expenditures compare in terms of NATO budget, the US contribution, and the European contribution? That's one thing. And my second question will be, now that you were talking also about the transformation of the alliance for new tasks, do you think since the Rome summit, almost 10 years now, in Rome summit, I was the Turkish policy planner attending the communique preparations, and we fought hard until midnight, but we couldn't move fundamentalist threats and terrorism from broader challenges to the main threat concept. So the Rome strategy was, the strategy text in Rome does not include fundamentalist threats and terrorism as its core main threats, but as a consensus we had them in the broader challenges part of the strategy. Now it's 10 years and much has changed, of course, and we are satisfied to see that our broader challenges have become the main threats of the alliance. But to what extent really has the mentality and preparedness of NATO has changed? Thank you very much.
I apologize. I'm not able to tell you any of the budget figures. I just don't keep those in my head at all. So I don't know that. But in terms of the discrepancy in capabilities, rather than focus overly on how wide the discrepancy is, we focus entirely on how to narrow the discrepancies and how to focus on the capabilities that are needed for the newly defined threats. The work that you did, we're very grateful for, but it, I'm sure, formed a very strong basis for the work that's the very good work and aggressive work that's underway in NATO councils right now to think in terms of not coming up with the definition of what is terrorism, but to define the threat in terms of what are the capabilities that are needed to combat that. What kind of chemical decontamination units do we have? Are the ones that the aspirants have sufficient? That kind of thing. What are the joint exercises that need to be done? That's why the joint exercise that was just done between NATO and Russia was terribly important. It was a whole exercise, 800 people, I don't know how many units involved in a chemical decontamination scenario. Very, very useful as far as all of the members were concerned. Was there another part to your question? The second part was related to the preparedness of preparedness. Well, that is what we've been working on, is to figure out what are the range of the new threats and what are the capabilities needed to address them. And in doing that, one of the other sort of subheadlines at the Prague summit, which is something that will be launched there and will take a lot of work, is to streamline the NATO structures. If we no longer need big tank battalions, maybe we don't need quite the headquarters all over Europe and sub-headquarters that we've had all these years. Maybe we need a much more streamlined organization so that we can spend money on working toward the new threats, working to combat the new threats rather than on having these big stationary headquarters.
Andrade, Lovett College. I had a question regarding the fundamentalism and things going on in North Africa and the Middle East. What's the NATO involvement for structural readjustment and things as education and such to combat maybe religious fanaticism from the roots instead of by diplomaticism instead of by military presence?
Well, NATO as an organization doesn't actually work in North Africa and the Middle East, but NATO member states and EU member states, of course, have, especially the EU and the US, have programs all over the Middle East, North Africa and the Middle East on all kinds of programs. But I'll bet Ambassador Dorici knows a lot more about those than I do at this point. But the thrust of your question, though, is a very important one. What is going on in terms of recognition by us and by our colleagues in Europe about exactly these kinds of issues? And one of the things that we realized in Pakistan is that we had neglected, to our detriment, education, the whole education sector. So we have a big new education program, particularly primary education, underway in Pakistan and Uzbekistan to try to address some of these issues. But I argue that the most important things we can do on top of education is to work toward democracy, because that's what's going to participatory democracy. That's what's going to help the most.
Thank you very much. I have to close it off because it's getting close to 9 o'clock, and I know the students have classes, and we could go on for another hour. But thank you very much for your wonderful participation. Let's come and have some breakfast.
I will.